Good morning, everyone, and thank you, David. Fascinating times we are living in. One might say a little bit too fascinating. But one interesting stat to hear, 15% of Americans today trust government and faith-based institutions to hold the moral high ground. What that tells me is it leaves a major wide gap for the private sector to step in and perhaps do the right thing, whatever that means. So today, for the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to be talking to two companies who are pushing the needle with regards to some pretty significant social issues of our time, one being gun violence and the other would be the support of refugees. So I am thrilled to introduce Kim Ruby, who heads social impact and philanthropy for Airbnb, and Ed Schuyler, who heads public affairs at Citibank. So we're going to dive right in, not take any punches here. And Ed, can you tell us what transpired behind the scenes to lead Citi to take a stance on what has traditionally been a very kind of disruptive issue?
I think probably a lot of us would agree that something changed after Parkland. And while there had been other atrocities in the past, there was just a different conversation. And we'd been asked at various points, what are your policies on firearms? And the reality was we didn't really have a clear policy, unlike other issues that carried reputational risk. We just didn't have one. We had a policy of escalation, which is just kicking things upstairs. So our CEO came and said, I don't think this is sustainable anymore. Show me some ideas. And what we did is we tried to balance respect for law-abiding gun owners and respect for the Second Amendment. We have a footprint across the country, almost every state, and that was important to us, but really try to focus on keeping firearms out of the wrong hands. And I worked for Michael Bloomberg for years, and he used to say, in God we trust, everybody else bring data. And we looked at some of the commonalities between mass shootings, and we centered a policy around a couple of best practices that a lot of our clients actually followed. So when you look at background checks have prevented 3 million illegal firearm sales or sales to people that weren't qualified to own them. When you look at the age restrictions we put on between 18 and 21, that segment of the society is 4 times more likely than those over 21 to commit a gun homicide. And bump stocks and high-capacity magazines are just making already lethal weapons even more lethal. So we decided that we would work with clients that follow these practices in their sales policies, and we'd work with our manufacturers to look at their supply chain. And it was not something that we took on lightly, but it felt in keeping with the mission of our company and our general quest to contribute to society. We don't know whether it's too much or too little, but the sense was that nothing was really changing in our society. And there's that heartbreaking quote about, when after Sandy Hook, somebody said that when we decided that killing children in school was bearable, we sort of lost, the urge to try to regulate firearms. And my company doesn't think it's bearable. I don't think our country thinks it's bearable. So we're trying to do our part.
Thank you very much. So I serve on the board of USA for UNHCR, and when I joined the board 4 years ago, there was a huge proponent or population of the American public that didn't know the difference between a refugee, a migrant, and an immigrant. Obviously, refugees were not top of mind. Question: how did Airbnb take this on as an issue to focus on, and take us behind the scenes?
Sure. Well, I think when the horrific images started surfacing, we're a global platform driven by a global community, and we realized if housing was a core thing that could help address the immediacy of what was happening, we could play a big role in that. So we worked with organizations like UNHCR and others to devise some pilot programs. And then you fast forward to the implementation of the travel ban last year. And we all sat around and we were talking amongst ourselves, like, we're fundamentally a travel company. Travel bans are bad for business. So
yeah.
obviously we want to speak out, but there's so much more we can do. And that's when we realized by taking a big commitment and making a big pledge to house 100,000 displaced people over the course of the next 5 years, we could both walk the walk and talk the talk. And I think what you were alluding to right at the beginning, it's such an interesting time right now. We hear from a lot of our NGO partners about political solutions failing, diplomatic solutions failing, and really they're relying on the private sector to lead the way and both speaking out, adapting policy changes, and really pushing change forward in a way that just isn't working in the other arenas like the way it used to.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I heard somebody once say that Airbnb, some senior person at Airbnb said, if you invite someone into your home, you're much less likely to kill them.
Yeah.
So hopefully that's the truth. What role, and this is for both of you, what role did employees play? And the reason I ask is I recently saw Jim Cramer on MSNBC actually talking about corporate responsibility, which I was shocked, right? I mean, that's so mainstream to be on television talking about it. But I'd be curious from both of your perspectives, was it a positive feedback? Was there any backlash from support of either one of these causes?
Yeah, employees played a huge role for us. I don't want to, out of respect for their privacy, I don't want to get into too many details. But we had
No names?
No, totally not. But we had employees that were personally affected by Parkland, and they got a lot of support from the company. But they also asked the question. They said, "Well, where are we on this?" And nobody had an answer. And so one of the reasons we did what we did is we wanted our people to have an answer, know where we stood. So I think on this issue, on Paris Agreement, climate change, immigration, I mean, I think employers are more and more vocal about where they work and the values they want to see their company support.
Yeah, the workforce has a huge impact, and I think a place like Airbnb, which is inherently mission-driven, they're signing up to work somewhere where they think they're going to be able to impact positive change, and they're always eager to do more and experiment and push the envelope, and it is really inspiring to see. And I think you can see that across the board. I mean, it feels like ancient history, but Tracy Chow, the Pinterest engineer who called for greater disclosure, it really helped shape the debate about and the need for driving greater diversity in tech and other industries. Someone writing a Medium post about their experiences can completely change
The trajectory.
Absolutely, and so I think it's really interesting times, and I think employees, in a certain sense, are just so well equipped to push companies to go even further than they might be initially contemplating.
Sure. And because we're at a tech conference, I have to ask, how did the role of social and technology play in both of you taking on these specific issues and maybe not other issues? It would be great to hear.
I don't, for us, I think social is another channel where we're getting feedback from people. And it hasn't displaced the traditional channels. And I'll tell you, we just had our annual meeting in Chicago a couple weeks ago, and you're prepared for people to come and either protest or say whatever it's on their mind. And we still get handwritten letters and questions from all quarters. So I don't think it's just another channel. But I think the danger sometimes is that you can assume you can allow the loudest voices on social to push you. And I think you sort of have to keep things in perspective, especially with some of the manipulation that goes on, that there might be other forces at work. So I think you have to take a little bit of a grain of salt with some of what you see on social, and not and have social listening and have your ears open, your eyes open, but don't assume that those are necessarily majority voices just because they're the loudest.
That's great advice. Noted. How about you, Kim?
Very similar. To the extent that people disagree with positions or stances we've taken, the way they express themselves can be really antagonistic and kind of rattling in some regards. But and the flip side of that is they know exactly where we stand, and for all intents and purposes, if they don't believe in the ethos of our form of travel, our form of hospitality, they're probably not going to be great guests or great hosts. And so for them to make other choices when they travel is absolutely fine with us.
Sure. It's interesting about taking it's a grain of salt on the social structure. My sister is the chief curator of the Guggenheim globally, and some of you may recall when the White House asked for a Van Gogh, she responded with a 24-karat gold toilet to the White House, and for 2 weeks she was vilified. I mean, to the point where it was rather scary. And thankfully, she lives here in New York, where people are a little more accepting of that point of view. But the Guggenheim was watching carefully of what the feedback was. But it came out about 60% pro and 40% con. So measurement. Typically, corporations don't take on any major initiative without trying to get a sense of, is this moving the needle? Is it bringing on more customers? Can you address that?
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember that, especially the issues on firearms regulation, is there are a lot of people that are on the other side of it.
Yeah.
So it's not as if you roll this policy and everybody slaps you on the back. And I think you see that as other banks try to figure out what they're going to do. There's a lot of strong voices on the other side, and we're getting, there's criticism that we're experiencing as well. And it goes back to why we tried to ground our policy the way we did and not make it about gun control, but try to keep it about keeping firearms out of the wrong hands. But when we measure things and we do external, we do brand tracking, this stuff is built up over time. I'm proud of our reputation as a leader in corporate sustainability, but we started that effort 20 years ago. So when we announced our latest, $100 billion commitment to clean energy and sustainable finance, it was coming off a $50 billion commitment from a few years before. Yeah. So I don't think you're going to see quarter to quarter huge swings. You can fall off a cliff if you have a problem. And I'm not, we've been in that boat, and some of our competitors have dealt with it as well, and other companies outside of finance. It sort of comes in on the camel and goes out on the leopard or whatever the cliche is. But you can take a dip pretty quickly, but having sustained growth in your brand attributes and value is really a little bit of a slog.
Well, but you're finding taking these stands also helps attract the best employees, retain your workforce, et cetera. Yes, no?
I mean, I think you gotta, listen, we have a huge site in South Dakota.
Right.
We were the largest employers there. I can tell you for a fact that this policy gets a different response in New York City, in Chicago, and San Francisco than it does with our people in South Dakota.
Yep.
And it's just they have a different experience with the gun issue.
Yep.
And it's not a negative one. It's part of their family history. It's part of how they enjoy themselves. It's a sporting thing, and so I hope it all balances out and it's a net positive. But I don't think we can assume that's the case.
No, it's a good point.
And for us, we're at large. This is the one area where we're not focused on measurement and we're not so metrics obsessed. I think it's for us. There's just a whole bucket of things where it's the right thing to do, and that drives the decision making. In one area that is a real standout, though, is employees consistently say that our work to help those in need and the stances we take on policy issues is their number one reason they choose to work at Airbnb. And that in our annual engagement surveys, that's always in the 80s to 90% range.
Wow, that's above the average for sure.
Yeah.
We have about 5 minutes for questions, if anybody. And I think that there's a mic. Why don't we take this lovely person here who was quick to jump?
Very quick.
I was making a note. If you'd like to.
Thank Thank you.
Hi, Kate McEwen. This is my second and not to be last techonomy. My question to you guys is about trust and slippery slopes. The gun issue. My brother and I voted for different people. We both think the government is corrupt. We just worry about who is the more dangerous. With regard to the gun issue, my brother would say we have a crazy government and a citizenry desperately trying to disarm itself. How crazy is this? I would say other things. Here's my question. Everybody's scared to death of the slippery slope. We don't trust each other. Things like Airbnb that foster trust, because basically the slippery slope is if you let somebody abort a child which is conceived by rape and all kinds of bad things, it's a slippery slope. Immediately we're going to abort everybody. Same with guns. If you start to regulate even a little bit, it's a slippery slope. And everybody trying to stay off the slippery slope when we don't trust each other, so nobody compromises. That's a comment and question to you.
I think that's what Citi is saying. You're really trying to kind of,
Yeah.
well, I'll let Ed.
I mean, listen, there is I think everybody knows who they are. There is a gun rights organization in this country that has taken that approach, that they do not want to compromise on anything because they do believe it's a slippery slope. And that argument has some appeal with people. What we've tried to do is not fall into the traditional gun control traps and fall into the allegation we're trying to take people's guns away, but try to really center on best practices that work, some of them that are adopted by states, and some of them that have wide public support of the practices we supported. 97% of people in this country support universal background checks. 97% of gun owners support universal background checks. 60% of 70% of our country think that we should have stronger gun regulation. A majority of Republicans and a majority of gun owners. So there is a slippery slope voice, which is a loud voice and a strong voice. But when you talk to people and look across the spectrum, there's a lot more consensus and desire for reasonable regulation than some voices would allow you to think. And that's why we tried to center our policy in those areas.
And business does tremendous amount of customer research before they take on these issues. Certainly in LGBTQ advocacy, in climate change advocacy, it follows how public opinion is going. There was a question, one more question, right here. Yeah.
Great. Hi, Kange Kanene, working for SAP based in New York. Kim, for you, can you just please elaborate more on what you mean when you say Airbnb is supporting refugees? I'm just not clear exactly on what you're providing.
Oh, sure. Thank you. I should have touched on that at the beginning. In the aftermath of the travel ban, we committed to housing anyone who was stranded in the weeks surrounding the decision, and then decided to take it a step further to work with our hosts to provide housing for 100,000 people through 2022. Our hosts are offering it for free. So we're working on tools to allow hosts to work with their friends, to welcome families into their communities, to offer their listings for free, and so on. And the stories are amazing. We had a host in Dallas who welcomed an Iraqi family. The father had been serving as an interpreter during the war for the US military. She got her temple so involved that they ended up raising $30,000 for the family to buy a car, made sure they got into all the good schools and the great after school programs. So it's amazing to see what people with just a few key tools can accomplish.
Airbnb also has funded an IRC, UNHCR, and other major organizations. So it's both grassroots and also philanthropy. All right. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks, Kim.